We're very fortunate to have Patricia here with us today. She is the curator at the Woodland Cultural Centre and has been for the last 4 years. And this is a role that she has taken on after a very extensive and ongoing artistic practice and curatorial practice. And it was a wonderful opportunity to have Patricia come and talk a bit about publications from another vantage point. So I'll just say a little bit about her background. She's a visual artist, curator, and writer, born in Oswego, Ontario, and her passion for art has played an instrumental role in the preservation and evolution of Indigenous art. Patricia's been an advisor for the Mushhole Project Curatorial Committee, Planet Indigenous, the Department of Canadian Heritage, CBC Art Spots, and has done amazing work with the Native Women's Healing Circle and Native Urban Youth. Her unique perspective as an artist herself and her years of contribution in the Indigenous arts community make her an important asset at the Woodland Cultural Centre and certainly an asset for us to have here today. So, Patricia.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm very delighted to respond to the title of the book and here to really kind of give a kind of a different perspective in the terms of as an artist, as a curator, and somewhat of a writer, which I never really aspired to because I just really wanted to make art when I was out of college, and that's all I wanted to do. Needless to say, I find myself here today wearing many roles and also acknowledging the people who have come before me to enable me to be where I am today. And so I just kind of want to again take a view of how all of this stuff kind of unravels itself and having how it fits kind of like an Indigenous art history, but it's also our Canadian art history within that global context. And being able to have the privilege of being able to support and celebrate and be inspired by the artist, it's really been quite the journey. And so for me, I just thought I would tell you a little bit about who I am as an artist, what goes on in my mind, because again, as an artist, as a role of curator, I get to ask those same sort of questions that I ask myself to 20 different artists, and of course, get 20 different answers. And I think what's wrapped up in a lot of the contemporary art is really acknowledging not only the similarities and differences, but realizing that, yes, it is a shared land, space, and history. So, going to work. Oops. Oops. Let's go back. Can we go back? How are we going back? Can you start me off? I'll let you push the button. Technology. So my journey, actually, I'll read my own clip notes. Is really how my artistic practice informs really my curatorial methodology and vice versa. I don't see them as being separate entities. And so as a painter, a lens-based artist, who also works with sound and video installation as well over the years, I approach contemporary art from a different perspective, by using really some of my own investigations of who we are and where we are and really who I am. And so, and trying to bring that into really a narrative writing style so that it does become accessible. So this is a quote from Pauline Johnson: "The beauty, strength, and power of the land will never sit or bend at my command." And when I was very young, I was given a book of poetry by Pauline, Flint and Feather. I think I was about 7 years old, something like that, for a present. And well, what kid wants, appreciates a book of poetry. I think I wanted an easy bake oven at the time. Didn't quite work out. Needless to say, years later, I would reference Pauline's work, not only within my own artistic practice, but my own curatorial practice. And so this is what inspires me, is really who has come before me and why and how this affects contemporary art. So next. So my line of questioning is really becomes what exists between those light and dark places. These dichotomies of the yin and the yang, of objective, subjective, and all of these differences in that they are polar opposites. And I think that becomes more apparent later in my curatorial field. But again, it's challenging those narratives and really kind of deconstructing how we use language. And language for me is, I don't personally have my own language, and I'm learning. However, it is a difficult language to learn. So I'm very happy to be where I am currently at the Woodland Cultural Centre, because again, we have all 6 languages from the community, and we have a language department that has access to all of our translators. So it's actually, very inspiring, and to see all the intergenerational connections there as well. And really, it's really about experiencing really what is inherent. And I think when it comes to looking at Marlene's work, I'm reminded very much so of how we relate in terms of mapping migration, and really not only remembering, but not so much in a nostalgic kind of sentimental view, but really just experiencing the moment. Next. And so that's kind of what I do when I walk the trails. And I've been very fortunate to do several residencies and to be out on the land. And what is it like to sit on a rock for 3 hours? How do you experience that? And what is our relationship to the land? And who went before us? And so all of these questions are in the back of my mind. I have no concrete answers, and I'm not really consciously really thinking of that when I'm sitting on a rock. But when I come to kind of think about who has been here, I think of, again, people like Pauline, who did travel across the country as a performer, reading her poetry. And so this particular one, the trail that winds and the trail that wanders, like a cobweb hanging high. Sorry. Just a lazy thread outlining midway at the stream and sky. And again, for me, it's really that intangibility that I really kind of appreciate. So next. And in order to appreciate of who we are, we have quite the extensive and different Indigenous history throughout North America. Here in Canada, again, it's like looking at the land and recognizing how our medicine wheels, our serpent mounds, all play a crucial role of who we are and where we came from. Because no matter how colonialism has affected each and every one of us, we still have the blood of our ancestors in us. And so how we interpret that becomes a very personal journey. So looking back, I look at how, for example, the Cree photographer James Throstle, who at the turn of the century worked alongside Edward Curtis. And of course, as you know, Edward Curtis was known for one of his portfolios of photographing Indigenous people across the land to capture the dying race. And of course, they were studio shots, and of course, they were all set up. And so you have these beautiful portraits that have been manipulated. But since James was kind of mentoring, you could see his photographs, and in his photographs, the differences, you could see the staging, you could see the props, you could see the rest of the community, you could see what's behind the backdrop. And I think, again, what do we choose to be authentic? What is the real? Also, again, the residential school system, again, has actually played a part in intergenerational art making, and again, coming forward to contemporary art. We have second, third, fourth generations of young artists who speak of those stories because their aunties, their grandmas, their family members have gone through that experience, and it kind of resonates throughout this history. Also, at the turn of the century, we forget that contemporary art, the National Gallery had turn of the century argillite carvings within their collection. The history behind the National Gallery, again, I think of when Diana Nemiroff bought Carl Beam's work, The Whale of Being. The European iceberg, sorry. The North American iceberg was, in fact, in response to the European iceberg show that they had mounted. And needless to say, that piece, along with Bob Boyer's piece, was actually first shown at the Woodland Cultural Centre at the annual Indian art exhibition. And so I'll get back to that in the role that Woodland has played in that history. We also think about, at least I think about, the different communities and what we have in common and what is different. We all have creation stories, but all told from a different perspective. Out west, for example, they used to have lantern projections on the sides of their longhouses. We have longhouses, but they're totally different and have a different function and protocol. And so when I come to talk about those similarities and difference from nation to nation, it's really nice to be back home to be able to tell our own stories. So next. And so I guess overall for me, it's all of this stuff that's floating out there. How do we contextualize this? And I think about the questions that I was confronted with when I was in school. Well, what is Native art? Well, it's a question that our senior curators had been asked back in the day. And believe it or not, we're still having that same sort of conversation. But for me, it is art within that it's grounded within a shared history, time, and place. So again, to be able to look at those histories, I was fortunate enough to go to the Paris residency and photographs the gardens. So I did a lot of research in what these UNESCO heritage sites were all about and how they are manicured and well preserved and taken care of and cataloged and one thing and another. And I use that more or less as kind of a metaphor for our cultures, because again, that's how we've been scientifically looked at as well from an anthropological point of view. And this is also what has denied us access to mainstream art. So again, a lot of the contemporary issues that I'm really kind of thinking of, anything from the environmental stewardship to food sources, clean water that we have the right for, and traditional knowledge, and how all of that kind of filters through and informs current contemporary practices. I always think about, in terms of going back to mapping and those border crossings and the history of treaties, and I often think, well, we all migrate, we all move from place to place, hopefully, and I always think about those little monarch butterflies, who go from one end of the continent to the other, and they do it all without the help of the aid of the Jay Treaty, for example. And how do we honor those land claims? And so all of the political governance as well becomes part of my internal chaos. And for me, it's about how do we apply, or how do we take this Western content of asceticism and connoisseurship and kind of fuse that with an Indigenous perspective for a sense of well-being and good mind. And of course, that comes back to reference of the Gasuminta, the Turo Wampum. So it's a form of, again, looking at the really how these things come together in terms of translating that knowledge, our identity and language. And for me, again, coming back to Woodland and how we have language to describe certain things. The Gonya Hall is, of the woman's mind, and we take privilege and prioritize our native languages over English because, again, we are very verb-based, and so we have to really describe an object in its context of place. So a chair is not simply a chair. It's a chair that is among a grouping of chairs situated on a platform within a room. And so the language becomes very explicit and very complicated very quickly. So again, when is a tree just a tree? So coming back, these issues of displacement, of privilege, entitlement, how do we achieve a sense of belonging and really a place called home? And I think a lot of our young contemporary artists are still really grappling with a lot of these issues. And I think really for me, it's about being really accountable to myself. I am just one voice, and I know nothing because I ask questions all the time. And so what do we take for granted? And what do we choose to ignore? And I think a lot of these questions come into play, and you can see it throughout the entire exhibitions and many more. So whether it's be a Spanish or French colonial process on Indigenous cultures throughout the world, we are looking at the aspects of how industrialization, the exploitation of our natural resources have effect on our community, and how that affects traditional gender roles and how we interact within the land. And so really, it really impacts that sense of well-being. Next. And for me, language, I think, is very important. A lot of some of my installation work incorporates text over the natural sound, and I have to use English. And so when I was in Mexico, just walking the streets of Merida, for example, I would come across these little placards on the corners of the streets. And they were very simple clip art with Leon, so people could learn the language, the Spanish language. And for me, it's just the opposite when I go to work. We privilege, our house language is Cayuga. So we learn how to say reception, gallery, museum. And so it also reminds me of the context of how art history kind of reveres our tapestries, and the tapestries are in museums. So looking at many of the tapestries in Paris and in these institutions, they were telling stories, and they were hung so that the general masses could really understand because they didn't read. And so the importance of how fabric, textile, opens up for me another can of worms of what is the role of fabric art, textiles, what was classified as women's work, men's work. And so all of these questions kind of come through, and just kind of how do I deal with that? And how do I reinterpret what I am seeing? Because all in all, having all said and done, our indigenous communities had a very much structured governance system already in place. And this is what the colonialism has done. And so now we see ourselves today talking about truth and reconciliation. And, but again, it is so diverse. Our board of directors, for example, is comprised of members who are both either from Confederacy or elected council. Again, talking about Jigaswinta, that gray area in between sometimes is really hard to navigate. So next. And so over the years, it's taken me a while to kind of really figure out how do I bring all of this stuff together and to create my own narrative, my own identity. And so I came up with this solution of photographing the land. And so this is just a simple black and white image of a stream. But of course, it has been manipulated. So it is actually a color process that I use. Each panel is about manipulated about half a dozen times and dropping in color. So I'm basically painting with light to create these pieces. And they're based on really the research that I've done on the history of gardens, as well as the history of our blankets, whether there be the history of the smallpox blankets to our trade blankets, the Pendleton blankets, the Coast Salish raven blankets, the button blankets. All of these make reference to community and individuality, and of course, place. So really it's about understanding that worldview. So the things that I kind of like to connect and kind of share with everybody and ask other artists is what are those threads that you're tugging at? Cultural, are they cultural? Are they political, spiritual, temporal, geographical, philosophical? All of these things become very important and very significant to what lies underneath. And I think that's really kind of those foundations that I'm trying to get at. And so as a curator, I've been able to ask these artists these same sort of questions. And so that was kind of my foray into curation. Like I said, I never aspired to be a curator. A friend of mine said, Pat, we're accepting proposals. I says, okay, I'll write one. Needless to say, it got accepted. This was the kind of, again, a first project initiated by the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre, who was one of the first institutions to dedicate, within their exhibition schedule, a show dedicated to contemporary Indigenous art. So I worked with artists and Indigenous designers for the catalogue, and as well as the establishment of the curatorial residencies for Indigenous artists, as well as moving that forward later and working with the, the BICI, the Banff Institute of Curatorial Studies, to again bring that curatorial perspective together with the curatorial global context. And so a lot of the publications you can Google, because again, many of our senior curators have contributed that critical writing, which is so desirable to do. And so again, writing for some of those publications becomes paramount. So this was staking land claims at the Walter Phillips Gallery. And so all of these issues that I asked myself as an artist, these artists have addressed. So you have Wolves in the City by Marianne Barkhouse, works by Kelly Green, The Light Box with Michael Balmore, in terms of clear cutting. How do we deal with deforestations in our land? Because again, reality is we still have to clothe and feed our families. But again, we also know exactly who we are. The salt licks on the left are a collaborative project between Marianne and Michael. Marianne has rights to her house pole. She comes from a long line of carvers. So they really cast the three sections of the little pole that everybody should be probably well aware of. It's the little pole that is in Stanley Park. It has the Thunderbird on the top, the bear, and the man in the middle. And we also have a replica of it at the Woodland Cultural Centre, because then we talk about all the isms, the stereotypes, and the racism that exists by just kind of reappropriating, what is indigeneity. So these cedar stands were built, and each section was then cast to represent Marianne's family and her history, as well as on the left is these beautiful copper stands that Michael made, where he cast a sweetgrass braid, a set of bear claws, and an eagle feather. And of course, once you put salt on copper, it eats into the copper, and so you have this residue left, this impression. So then it becomes a beautiful yet horrific metaphor for our communities. I was very fortunate to take advantage of the Aboriginal Curatorial Residencies, a program that the Canada Council initiated by Leanne Martin. So while I was here, I did Between You and Me, brought together several artists from across Canada. And to me, it's kind of bringing back that artistic practice of experience of how we meander through these trails. So these installation views, you can just kind of see like little hints of the words on the painted walls. But it's in terms of relationships to family, mother, sister, brother. Because again, everything is interconnected. It is all of our relations. And Marianne has this on the right is a suite dealing with her family, but she's also incorporated her language into the work. And I remember spending like almost over an hour trying to pronounce some of these words, because again, language is very, very difficult. And so I think I remember Yola as being the son. But anyway, next. And so as you traverse through this exhibition, it's again bringing these points of contact and these points of reference all together, which have a very personal nature to the individual artist, but it really talks to the larger picture of society, of how we respond to all of these incidences. So Laurie Claremont, for example, on the right here, every 6 minutes, a child went missing. And so she did these beautiful cyanotype prints of a christening gown. Tributaries, midway twixt heaven and earth, was a ceramic exhibition, ceramic and glass, held at the Clay and Glass Gallery in Waterloo. And again, it's using contemporary art, but very much grounded within our worldview. So in the center of the exhibition was the family work of the Smith family. Oliver and Elda worked under Flint and Feather, who used very traditional Haudenosaunee designs. And her son Lee, for example, or Steve, went on and did his own version. But again, he was influenced by a lot of the Hopi pottery. But again, and then Santi, for example, his daughter, who is also a choreographer. I'm sure you're all very well familiar with Santi Smith's work. It's very lyrical and very dynamic. And so these are words that you would describe not only as a dancer, but how they are interchangeable within her pottery. And again, this is the work by Casey Adams. It's a very participatory piece dealing with water, clean water, and bringing it back to community. So it's a very interactive piece that she made these porcelain vessels, and using the stream that's outside of the Clay and Glass, members were invited to fill their little pots from this jug of water from the river. Would you want to drink the river water? I'm not quite sure. But again, a lot of our artists over time have really dealt with these very specific issues. And I think of artists like Rebecca Belmore, who did this beautiful temple piece was shown at the power plant, several years ago, from the Don Valley. And so water rights is still very much part of our everyday life in our communities. On the left is the work of brother and sister Kenny and Rebecca Baird. Again, being Cree from out west, they were dealing with a lot of the oil fracking that was happening out there. And so they created this wooden nickel covered in oil, which spills down and into this nest with the golden egg. But of course, the nest is filled with oil. And so again, we're talking about commodity economics, all of these structures that affect our communities. Next. And again, this is work by Marianne Nicholson, again, dealing with water rights. And her home is Kincome Inlet. And they recently had dammed the river and therefore caused major flooding within the village, so much so that the village was overcome. And so she created these glass pieces, basically of the trickster, and the title is in her language, so I will not attempt. But the basis of this piece is that when you project the image onto the wall, it's projected onto a text that is 6 feet high, and that's how far the dammed river came up into their community. But again, it's based on our material culture, the cedar bent boxes that are prevalent in their community. So that brings me to my current position as curator at the Woodland Cultural Centre. And I'm very well aware of whose desk I sit behind while I'm there, given that Tom Hill has retired. But again, being one of Canada's first Indigenous curators in Canada, him and his senior peers have been instrumental in moving forward that Indigenous art history. And Woodland has played really a pivotal role in that. And so we celebrated our 50th anniversary. And so needless to say, I didn't really have access to a lot of the collection work. So I thought, what can I do? So in order to talk about that legacy of that timeline of those contributions, I decided, well, I'll pull some of our publications. So what you see here is really kind of just scratching the surface of that timeline. So back in, it was the 70s when the Professional Native Indian Artists Incorporated, known as PNAI, and most recognizable in terms of the Indian Group of Seven, which was coined by a Winnipeg journalist. That was kind of the foundation of the collection of Woodland. Woodland opened up in 1972, and the first exhibition of Indian art was in 1974. And so a lot of works were pulled from Daphne's studio. And so these are our icons of Indigenous art history. And so the publications that kind of filter through the years are very important to recognize their contributions because, again, if you flip to the next slide, you'll see the quote from Daphne, which says, "We had no one to show our work, so we had to do it ourselves. We acknowledged and supported each other as artists when the world of fine art refused us entry. Together, we broke down barriers that would have been so much more difficult if doing it alone." And to some extent, it still exists today. There's been movement, of course, to get us where we are today, but we still have a long way to go. And so these are some of the major publications representing those group of artists. And of course, we celebrate our local artists as well. So in the background, in this shot, David General's on the left, but then you have Vince Bomberry, Duffy Wilson, and Garfield Thomas, who are our traditional carvers. And their work is so important because it's so grounded within our worldview. And it's coming back to those very foundations. And so how that gets translated within our community is very relevant when it comes to talking about our language and those interconnections and all of those relationships. And so this is why it becomes so important to recognize and celebrate the cycle of ceremonies. And of course, over the years, there's been major pivotal exhibitions that have contributed to that ongoing dialogue. And these are just some of the books, such as Land, Spirit, Power, 1992, very iconic year for us all. Indigena, an exhibition curated by Leanne Martin and Gerald McMaster. At the same time, New Territories was happening in Montreal. And before that, Beyond History, which was one of those seminal exhibitions from the Vancouver Art Gallery. And of course, Tom, along with Rick Hill, one of our most senior curators, artists, wrote Creation's Journey for the Smithsonian. And so again, this is just an installation view of really realizing how these worlds are intersected. The object on the left is a sculptural piece by Ben Thomas, Torn Between Two Lovers. Very iconic and very, it's very iconic and significant, talking about all of these relationships. And of course, contemporary issues, a pottery piece by Brenda Hill dedicated to the murdered and missing women. Next. And again, it's a time also when artist collectives were being formed, anything from Circle Vision to NEPA in Hamilton. So there was a lot of activism and advocacy from the artists themselves, which was really initiated back from the 70s. So this is just, again, just an installation shot of the opportunity to be able to pick up some of these writings and take a look and get that point of view. Also, in recognition of the work that has been done, even within the National Film Board, you can see kind of their timeline from back in 1968, having programs for Indigenous filmmakers right up to currently 2022. So they have an extensive history. And of course, our senior filmmakers, of course, Alanisa Bomselman, and all the influences that she has had on our young filmmakers have influenced people like Shelley Nero, and the list goes on and on. And so I made a little list of some of our notable filmmakers and directors. And of course, we screened Charlie Squash Goes to Town, a film by Duke Redbird, one of those first films back in the 70s. So there's a lot to unravel here, and it will take a long time to kind of talk about every piece, but I just wanted to really just kind of give a general overview of kind of the last 50 years in like 30 minutes. Good luck. But I mean, I think these were pivotal moments, and they were kind of epiphanies for me, coming to the field through the back door, because again, a lot of us, you know, like I say, Tom was always an artist first, and he wore the caps of director, artistic director, curator, writer, consultant, advocate, father, and you know, and so all of these roles that we play kind of filter through because, as Daphne said, there was nobody else to do it. So again, I would just like to carry on that legacy because Woodland has always supported me in my artistic career, and so I'd like to share that with everyone, and also with, of course, the artists. And it's so nice to see the artists being included in mainstream exhibitions, acquisitions. We've made changes to policy changes, and most recently, Janice Montour, our former artistic director, is now the CEO of the Canadian Museum Association. So I'm really expecting a lot to happen in the next 10 years in terms of change within the system, which affect our artists and how we present our work. Because as the narrative storytellers, publications remain the residue. And again, I always question why we do it and who we do it for. And I like to think that, you know, one of these publications will actually maybe find its way in the hands of a 10-year-old kid who just likes to draw. So in Yahweh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was incredibly rich and really great information for all of us. We've kept you until we said we were going to, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I think we'll take about 15 minutes to have a little discussion, and that'll be a lot to do in 15 minutes, but we'll do our best. Chuck, can we get Jeff back on screen? Yeah, if he's there. So while we're bringing Jeff onto the screen, I just wanted to say a couple of things about what we've heard, just to kind of remind us of the journey we've been on. So when we opened, Jeff talked a bit about introducing the two-row wampum structure to our exhibition project, and that in a way gave a kind of a shape to the kind of relationship that we wanted to build our exhibition around. And then Ruth and Katie, in talking about the development of the GardenShip book, I think they kind of asked the question, what is a book in this case? And it seemed to me that Katie really sort of leaned into this question that she was able to ask all the artists. It was great to hear from Michelle and Tom about the almanac and the way in which that kind of a publication can, in effect, reflect on the way that they were working and we are working with community. And then Marlene's wonderful talk really brought language to the forefront, both as material and as a means of making the world both poetic and real. And Pat's talk was a really comprehensive journey through her own art practice and also the kinds of work she is doing in service to the Indigenous artist community and also the wider community. So there's Jeff. Jeff, I don't know if it's fair to ask you, but I was thinking maybe we could start off, I was thinking about the fact that doing our book was a lot of work. Was there anything for you in that experience that was particularly sort of enlightening or memorable? I know that's a big question, but I wonder if you wanted to start and just kind of reflect a little bit on that journey of making the book.
Yes, I had some thoughts that came to mind, and I was thinking about something that Marlene had said about, what was it, subversive mapping. And I like that term because it reminded me of a road trip that I made a number of years ago. I think it was 2010 when I was curating another exhibition, and I took my son along with me on a journey along the Grand River. When I was much younger and I was visiting my elders at Six Nations, Emily General, she was a great teacher, and she just had some really great thoughts about political activity and everything, theater. And she had a book lined in the dining room, and it was about, I had a Joseph Brandt, the National Gallery cover, or the National Gallery portrait of Joseph Brandt on the cover. And it was kind of a combination of stories about Joseph Brandt and also about negotiations along with the Grand River. And the fact that the Haldeman tract, when it was first given to Joseph Brandt in return for his support during the American Revolutionary War, it went right from the head of the Grand River to where it empties into Lake Erie. And I remember that I used to look through that book when I was little, and I didn't really understand a lot of it, actually most of it, because it was, government speak and everything. And I was just a little kid, but I was intrigued by the photograph of Joseph Brandt standing by the Grand River. So I decided that I wanted to find the head of the Grand River. And so I brought my son Bear along with me. We drove north and finally came to, and I used a map that, Google map, and also some information that the Grand River formed from 3 small streams. So we got up and found in an old, in a cow pasture, probably where the Grand River begins. And it was very small, like a trickling of the water out of the cow pasture underneath the road and that. And I photographed my son there. It was interesting because it completed a childhood journey for me, but also the fact that ongoing negotiations, how they were still going on, and just the debate over what was sold, what was given away about Joseph Brandt and his role with settlers and bringing them onto the reservation or onto the reserve and selling land and this. So, there was no clear-cut kind of view of what was taking place. But what I found is that it was interesting for me because my history actually began in Buffalo, where I was born and raised, But it also had been the place where Joseph Branton, a Seneca chief or a Seneca leader named Red Jacket, began fighting over where the Confederacy fire was going to be relit after the Revolutionary War. And Joseph Branton wanted to go to Canada. Half of the Confederacy wanted to stay in the United States. And Joseph Branton ended up going to Canada and taking about half of the Confederacy with him, along with my ancestors. So Buffalo resonated as a place of my homeland, and I could say that I was born near the Buffalo Creek Reservation. To myself, nobody else would know what I was talking about. But it was important information for me because it really gave a sense of landscape, about mapping, about taking responsibility for mapping, and so what does it all mean in the end? So it's been a large part of my work in terms of mapping, and it began in 1992 in light of the Columbus celebrations that were taking place in the United States, the 500th anniversary. And at that point, I made a road trip across the United States and back through Canada. And I had all these places planned that I was going to photograph: Mount Rushmore, Crazy Horse, different places. And I did some of that, but the thing that upset me the most about that trip was the space between each of those sites. And I could have made that entire trip from Kingston, Ontario, down to St. Louis, across the continent to Washington State and back through Canada, and never seen another Indigenous person. Although I did at times, but it was the reality that I could have done it without seeing any other Indigenous people. And that's where the idea for my work really began in terms of mapping. And so when Bear and I were traveling back from having found the head of the Grand River, I was trying to track it back, and I pulled over into a farm, and it had a very long driveway. So I pulled over and made some photographs. The next thing I know, a big pickup truck pulled up next to us, rolled down the window, and there was this woman with a very angry face, and she threatened us, and she said, "Get out of here," and blah, 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 going on and on. And it was the reality of how the land is seen, how it's possessed, how it's owned, everything kind of conflated into that one experience, and she threatened us with a gun. And that's the reality of living in Canada, and it's always there. So subversion becomes a very common denominator when I'm working. And even in Brantford, I was pulled over by the police because somebody reported me driving around and photographing things from my car. So I just wanted to leave that because I think that those kind of stories really build in terms of how we curate and putting that kind of energy. And you don't have to talk about it, but it's those experiences that come together and how we lead as curators and what we want to accomplish, what we want to say, and how do we reach out and how do we begin building relationships and allies once again for today? How do we build a better world for our children? And so this is the idea. And this is why the book was so important in terms of GardenShip and State, because I imagined sitting down with my elder and showing her the book and getting her impressions about it. And I could just imagine our conversation in my head. I wish that I could do that more than anything else, was to sit down with her and show her that book, because that's how proud I am of it. And I know that it'll resonate for generations to come. And this is what we're talking about here on this panel, about the book and what is the future. So that's just some of my impressions.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It strikes me that, you mentioned the book, the Brant book being given to you when you were 8, and that it was a kind of a beginning, I guess, and then a beginning of a journey that really had a lot to do with the land and a sense of self and place. And Pat mentioned receiving the book of Pauline Johnson's poetry when you were young, and it wasn't an Easy Bay Coven, but probably had a lot more value to you in your life than an Easy Bay Coven. I'm thinking of a book as a kind of a container, and yet as artists, we're often trying to really create experiences. So then why do we need books? And so I wondered if maybe some of us want to kind of weigh in and say, if we have any thoughts about what a book might do differently than an art exhibition, for example, and how the book can become necessary. I mean, it is a record, but there's other things that books can do. We don't have to lean into the book completely, but this is something that I thought we might want to sort of chat a little bit about. Marlene, do you want to start? You don't have to. Somebody else can.
I feel like I've already taken up a lot of airspace, so maybe some of the others would like to.
Okay. Should I call someone out? Ruth, any thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I'm really personally invested in what books can do. And I think that there are a lot of ways to tackle that, what a book can do personally, what a book can do culturally, what a book can do politically, what a book can do materially. There's no end to that question. And I'm thinking, of course, right now, really in terms of politically, and I'm thinking also in terms of an experience of time with a book is something that is truly subjective. And even moving around an exhibition space, that can be very wonderful, long, subjective time. But I do think that there's something, a really great example of this was the recent exhibition here involving Sandra Semchuk. And I was in the space and it was so moving that my immediate thought was like, I've actually just got to get this book and sit down with it because I can't have the same access into this work in physical space where I'm kind of expected to operate in very specific ways and not respond to things in the way that I feel like I kind of need time to respond to them. So I might just leave it there.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody else? Katie?
I think maybe I'm jumping ahead to another answer, but related. Sometimes I think of books as an escape. We all might use them, or dissociative tool almost. And then my goal with designing GardenShip was the opposite of that, to create almost a community within the pages of the book and a way to have connections with all the other contributors of it. Not just for us with each other, but that so through the book, the whole ethos of GardenShip would have everlasting life through our community connection and then our larger community connection with everyone who decides to pick it up after.
Thank you. That's great. And it makes me think actually of what Marlene is doing with her work, where it is creating poetics and it's also really pointing to reality. Others, Michelle?
Is that on? Yeah, okay. I think this panel has challenged me to think more about how the work that I'm doing in the Coves, and a lot of it is writing, but is intended to be transmitted orally. And there's a lot of storytelling and world making that happens on the land through our workshops, but the reach can be, we always gain a person, it feels like. It's gaining momentum, but the reach is limited. And I'm hearing what people are saying about the importance of experiences you have with books when you're children. And the community engaged work that we're doing on the land is so important because our children are involved. Kids are always with us. And the stories live on in them. You really feel that when kids return again and again to that space. They want to tell you the stories that they have learned and internalized and have reformulated, and that child has become a part of that story. So I really want to expand my thinking about how those things can exist in a book form, because my brain goes to the oral transmission all the time. And the way that kind of storytelling is layered on experience. So instead of retreating or being isolated, we're layering the story on the sound, on the smell, on the presence there. I don't know how that's going to work in a book, but worth thinking on.
Great. And it seems like a great lead-in for Tom. in that, you know, your work, we could say, it typically is expecting to find its place in a book. And yet we have all known you to be cleaning up rivers and working very actively with us and so actively in the community. So what's that about?
I'm really intrigued by what you just said about the book being a container. I deal with containers a lot when I'm picking up garbage. We're always, filling up containers, which also sparked another thought to something you said, Patrick, when you were interviewed for the film that we made about how picking up garbage is about, environmental degradation and about pollution, but it's also about lives. You said, it's also about lives. These objects have passed through hands. And so it's a kind of a garbage pile is also a kind of catalog of lives and experiences and loss. So those are just two things that kind of triggered for me. I also just wanted to, after being at this Words Festival all day yesterday and today, I now have the stack of books. And that stack of books represents to me a looking forward to having time to reading them, which I don't. But I think that's also something that the book affords as you look at it, and that represents a time and attention in a kind of community with the writers and the participants. That's a real, in some ways it's a luxury, but it's also really a necessity for us to slow down and have that time and a place where that time occurs, which is a book.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me think, sometimes that pile of books feels like an obligation, and yet it also feels like a promise. And I think we need to live up to the promise. So, Marlene, do you want to go next, or shall I jump to Pat? I can ask you a specific question, but maybe I'll jump to Pat.
Okay.
And I'll say, Pat, your talk was so wonderful, and also I think it really reminds us that some histories really do need to be recorded and basically disseminated, understood. And I feel like you've done a lot of work in that regard. Do you think that Indigenous art has been well served in sort of modern and contemporary times by publications? I mean, are the stories around it the right stories, do you think?
Yes and no. I think for me, it's, and I think a lot of it for the artists, it's not about the documentation, but it is, again, about being in the moment, in the present, and taking away that energy and processing what that means to understand the beauty or what resonates in the moment. And I think of performance artists, for example, the body of Rebecca Belmore, for example, it's all very much in the moment, and the documentation is not the same. And so the documentation becomes its own entity. Mm-hmm. And so how you interact with the tangible versus the intangible becomes something different that you have to really disassociate yourself. Because again, you can experience the book in its entirety, whereas if you're not sitting at a kitchen table relating a story and having it recorded and sitting, in an easy chair, that experience is, it's where does that energy go? Mm-hmm. And how do you process that? So very much so, it is different because again, we live in such an instantaneous world. And that's kind of some of the problematics with some of the contemporary work. I'd asked Steve, Steve, there's a lot of youth, interested in making these ceramic vessels. And he said, no, not really. And I said, well, why? Because it's all storytelling. It's all relating our traditional knowledge. And he says, but the process, it's also long because it takes, it's an Italian sgraffito effect that he uses to make his pottery. And it's like, okay, all right. I know they'd rather be playing on their Game Boy or whatever, and talking to social media buddies, and so I think our priorities have to change of what has value. And it comes back down to those foundations, I think.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were speaking was the idea of capture. And sometimes a book might capture something in a particular way. And I was thinking with your work, Marlene, which is really getting at something you might say very ephemeral, and at the same time, it's really there. These kinds of snow and ice really have difference. And so I wonder if, when I think about you conducting walks, is there a way in which making a book is something very different than conducting a walk, or do you see those things as somehow kind of imbricated or woven together?
Oh, that's a whole new thing to ponder. Sometimes I read some of the poems that are in the book. So there is a connection. They do become, presented out loud to people. But I haven't done very many walks in the winter. I have done a couple, and I did one for some grade 12 students once in the winter. So they all had to bring snowshoes and cross-country skis and everything. And one of the things I do, because I did mention about the memory mapping, one of the things I do a lot when I have children come is I have tables and chairs set up, and I ask them all to draw a map of the walk that they've just done. None of them had ever been there before. It's all brand new place, and everybody's map is it's completely different. Everybody's map is completely different, even though they've just done the exact same walk. And it's just so interesting to see what registers in their memories from not just what they saw, but what they learned from the poems that I read them. I have natural historians that accompany the children and tell them natural history. And I've really gone away from what your question was.
Well, yes and no. It seems, I really kind of love the sort of process that your work describes. And it's as if what you're talking about now is a form of capture or recording that could find its way into a book. But it can't happen until the experience has happened, I suppose, is partly what you're getting at too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to look at the audience for a few seconds and say if there are any questions out there, we would love to entertain them. On the other hand, we have kept you a long time, so if you need to go home to your roast beef dinner, that's okay too. Anybody? Then I think I'm going to, oh, great, please. Yeah.
You've been dealing with what goes into the book, what comes next, and for readers is what comes out of it.
Yeah.
So it's, we're dumping the container into the world. And it's tremendously exciting to think of books as evocations, as provocations, as what comes next, and hopefully encourages and enlightens and inspires us all. And I think this book does it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That is a wonderful way for us to end this wonderful afternoon. So I thank you, the audience, and very much my colleagues here. And it was a wonderful time to be together. So thank you. And if you want the GardenShip book,